So I'm going to play you one of the strangest clips I've ever seen, and I have seen a lot of strange clips. This is a long clip, but I want to play the whole thing because it is just so amazing, and it's what we're going to be talking about a lot today. This is Newt Gingrich on Harris Faulkner's show, and you will hear the lady's voice that you hear at the end is Marie Harf, who is a liberal commentator. Newt Gingrich explaining why so many criminals are being released to commit crimes again as crime goes up. The murder rate is going up in Democratic cities across the country. Here's Newt explaining why, part of why that's happening.
The number one problem in almost all these cities is George Soros elected left-wing, anti-police, pro-criminal district attorneys who refuse to keep people locked up. Just yesterday, they put somebody back on the street who's wanted for 2 different murders in New York City. You cannot solve this problem, and both Harris and Biden have talked very proudly about what they call progressive district attorneys. Progressive district attorneys are anti-police, pro-criminal, and overwhelmingly elected with George Soros' money, and they're a major cause of the violence we're seeing because they keep putting the violent criminals back on the street.
I'm not sure we need to bring George Soros into this.
I was going to say you get the last word, Speaker.
He paid for it. I mean, why can't we discuss the fact that millions of dollars he spent?
I agree with Melissa. George Soros doesn't need to be a part of this conversation.
Okay. So it's verboten.
All right.
So it's verboten to mention that George Soros has, in fact, been funding these DAs, these lax DAs who look for opportunities to charge police with acts of malfeasance, but look also for opportunities to release criminals back into the society, and also to take away systems like bail, which keep them in prison where they belong. We can't mention George Soros. And by the way, if you couldn't see it, Marie Harf, the prissy look of self-righteousness on her face when she says, oh, we're not going to mention George Soros, was quite something to behold. Why aren't we going to mention George Soros? Because George Soros is an evildoer who uses his money to do evil. He has been doing evil for a long time. He believes America is the problem with the world. He is also, in the most a random sense of the word, a Jew. I mean, he's not a religious Jew. He's anything but a religious Jew. And he is a collection, it is absolutely true, he is a collection of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic cliches. He's a collection of anti-Semitic cliches. He's stateless. He believes in being stateless, what they call cosmopolitan. He has no loyalty to any state. He uses money to operate behind the scenes. He's very wealthy, and he uses that money to influence politics. He is, in fact, a collection of anti-Semitic jokes. I mean, if you got one of those Hitlerian pamphlets and it described what Jews were doing, it would be what George Soros is doing. Well, you know, there's a reason for this, and we're going to talk about it. But the fact is, when you allow racism to come into your thoughts at all, you start to do crazy stuff like silence Newt Gingrich telling the simple truth. And I will explain to you why it is, in fact, the simple truth. George Soros is not evil because he's Jewish, but he is a Jew who does very bad things and does them in a way that plays into these stereotypes. Stereotypes do not come out of nowhere. Stereotypes are people's observations. And as I always say about bigots, it's not that bigots are wrong about the people they hate. It's that they're wrong about themselves. We all suck. That's the point. It's not that Jews are worse than anybody else. It's that everybody's terrible. And if you pick a group and if you look at them in terms of their culture, it's really not race, it's culture. If you look at them in terms of their culture, they are going to exhibit traits that are in keeping with that culture and can be turned into stereotypes. George Soros is a case in point. A black mugger is a case in point. A WASP, who's an elitist bigot, is a case in point. These things all exist. They're all real. You can't ignore them and say, oh, because you're picking on this guy, it's anti-Semitic. I once did a roast for Ben Shapiro, and it was at a Jewish gathering. And one of my jokes was, I said, you know, there's a horrible, and it really is a horrible anti-Semitic libel. It's called the blood libel, the idea that Jews kill Christian children to make their matzah. And I said, you know, it's a terrible thing to accuse Jews of this just because it's something Shapiro happens to enjoy. And the joke, of course, is that individuals do bad things, and they are not exempt from those things because of their race. So Hot Air did an excellent article today, and it quotes it basically backs up what Newt Gingrich says. Here's from the New York Times. A district attorney race on the banks of Lake Ontario has become an unlikely big money referendum on traditional law and order prosecutors, much like similar battles in Boston, Philadelphia, and Queens, New York. The race in Monroe County pits a Republican incumbent, Sandra Dorley, against an insurgent challenger, Shawnee Curry-Mitchell, a progressive newcomer who has drawn the attention and backing from the billionaire George Soros. Since early October, Mr. Soros has spent more than $800,000 on ads in this little race. Here's the Philadelphia Inquirer. Also last year, George Soros is back in Pennsylvania politics with a new $1 million investment, and $100,000 of that is being spent in support of another Democrat seeking to become a district attorney. Soros also spent money on DA races in Virginia going back to 2016. Politico published a story about Soros' desire to reform the criminal justice system by spending money to elect progressive prosecutors. This is from Politico. While America's political kingmakers inject their millions into high-profile presidential and congressional contests, Democratic megadonor George Soros has directed his wealth into an under-the-radar 2016 campaign to advance one of the progressive movement's core goals, reshaping the American justice system. In St. Louis, Soros has donated money on and on and on. Now, again, as I say, the racists are not wrong about the people they hate. We're all hateful. They're wrong about themselves. They're hateful too. So if you're pointing at somebody else, this is why you judge not, right? Lest you be judged. If you're pointing at somebody else, you're not paying attention to the things that you can change. So what we are seeing now, and the reason I bring this up, it's not just to go after George Soros. So I'm always happy to go after George Soros. It's not just because of that. It is because murder is on the rise. Here's from Paul Cassell in the Wall Street Journal. He's a college professor in Utah. Cities across the country suffered dramatic increases in homicides this summer. And this is important because this happened back in the 80s and 90s. And I was there, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I lived in New York at the time. It was deadly dangerous to be in New York. Murders were on the rise. And people did something. And there was a reason it happened, and there was a reason it went away. But let's just look for a minute at what's happening now. Cities across the country suffered dramatic increases in homicides this summer. The spikes were remarkable, suddenly appearing and widespread, although often concentrated in disadvantaged neighborhoods. This year is on track to be the deadliest year for gun-related homicides since at least 1999. Now that, for people who follow crime, that is a magic number. It is in the 90s when this finally was turned around. So if we're going back to 1999, we are going very much in the wrong direction. The homicide, reading again from Cassell, the homicide spikes began in late May. Before May 28th, Chicago had almost the same number of homicides as in 2019. Then on May 31st, 18 people were murdered in Chicago, the city's most violent day in 6 decades. Violence continued through the summer. July was Chicago's most violent month in 28 years. As of September 1st, murder is up 52% for the year, according to Chicago Police Department data. Now, last weekend I think there were 56 shootings in Chicago and 13 fatalities. Here is the police superintendent, I think what's his name? David Brown, is it? I think that's his name. Yeah, David Brown, explaining why this is going on.
One of the shootings this weekend was someone we had arrested for possessing an illegal gun. So this person is in that number, and they're on electronic monitoring, and they're involved in a shooting where 6 people are shot. And this person has 7 felonies, and yet they're out on the streets in our neighborhoods on electronic monitoring. What are we doing? I mean, it's beyond frustrating. It makes your blood boil if you're one of those victims to a person that's out of jail on electronic monitoring that had previously 7 felonies and was arrested by Chicago police officers, and his gun was recovered for possessing an illegal gun because he's a felon in possession of a gun, and yet he's out of jail.
Is there anyone who can look at this American law officer, and when he says this is beyond frustrating, makes your blood boil, and not feel what he's talking about? Can you not feel what it is to be a police officer whose job is to keep the streets safe, whose job is to keep the people safe, who look out and say, this is my city, I am here to keep it safe, who take the risks that they do, who pay? You know, and I've talked about this before. The worst thing we ask of the police, the thing that we ask of the police that is the most painful, is not to risk their lives, though they do risk their lives. It is to see reality as it is without surcease, without any rest. They see reality in a way I don't, in a way you don't. They look at at human nature at its lowest possible level. I've known a lot of cops. It gets to them over time. It wears away at their faith. It wears away at their faith in humanity. It's a very difficult thing to do. And to face all that and to take all that on for society, for the sake of society, and have some clown of a Soros-backed DA let this guy back out to kill again has got to drive you crazy.